Good evening, everyone. Good to have you here for our end of life options. Um, we've got a couple of other speakers, and I am going to introduce one of them first because unfortunately he's got to leave. His wife is having some surgery, and so of course he needs to leave and take care of her. But Stuart Florsheim is a poet and is on the board of End of Life Options. And he was one of my congregants when I worked up in Oakland at Temple Sinai many years ago. And he's the person who really introduced me to Compassion and Choices and to the legislation that we've passed in California and really launched me into being an advocate for this sort of thing. So I'm really happy that he was able to be here tonight, part of it. I'm going to ask people to please mute themselves. And Stuart, please tell us a little bit about why you got involved in these end-of-life choices.
Sure, be more than happy to do that. So, thank you so much, Rabbi, for for the introduction and also, of course, for hosting us. This is a very important topic. So I got involved in end-of-life choice because of my mother's illness, which happened about 20 years ago, actually. She was living in New York. She was a Holocaust survivor. And she found out that she had ALS, which, as most of you know, is a horrible disease. And as soon as she found out that she had ALS, she reached out to me because we were very close, and she said, "You have to help me." And I sort of knew what she meant, but I also wanted to push on her because I wanted to make sure that I really understood what she wanted. And she told me she wanted me basically, not in so many words, but she wanted me to hasten her death because she felt like she had been through the Holocaust and she did not feel like she earned, the pain of, like going through what ALS was going to take her through. So to make a long story short, I spoke to her doctor, and the doctor said, "Oh, if things get really bad," excuse me, we can help her, without really explaining what that meant. And I didn't really feel comfortable with that. So I did a bit of research, and I found out about an organization called Compassionate Choices. And they had like a branch in New York City. So they came to talk to my mom. At this point, and even now, unfortunately, end-of-life choice is not legal in New York. But they came to talk to my mother and to me about what she could potentially do to hasten her death. And it turned out, like in most cases, she ended up not doing anything legally with medication. They recommended that she put morphine patches all over her body, when she was still able to do that. But she decided, she ended up not doing it. She knew what she had to do. Every so often she would ask me what to do, and I would remind her, and then she would feel comfortable, and she would basically go back to resting, and she ended up passing away on her own. But just knowing what she could potentially do gave her a great deal of comfort. And that is a lot of what the end-of-life choice movement is about. A lot of people do get the medication, and I think about a third of people end up not taking the medication because they passed away before, but just having the medication, having access to it, gives them a great deal of relief. So after my mother passed away, I decided to get more involved, specifically with Compassionate Choices, because they were just so incredibly helpful. And I joined the board of Compassionate Choices in Northern California. I became the co-chair, which is a role I held for about 4 years. And then I left Compassionate Choices mostly because I got very busy at work. And after I retired, which I just did about a year ago, I decided to join the board of End of Life Choices California. So I'm a proud member of End of Life Choices California now. They do fantastic work in helping people facilitate end-of-life decisions in California. And Judy will tell you more about that after the rabbi gives her talk. So again, thank you for being here. Thank you for hosting us. And I hope you enjoy the presentation.
Thank you, Stuart. Really appreciate it. So I'm going to present a little bit, and then Judy Neal Epstein, who is from End of Life Choices, I'll give you a more full introduction when she's going to be speaking. She'll follow me, and then we'll leave room for some questions and some comments and any experiences that people have that they would like to share. So close your eyes and imagine yourself lying on a cramped bed. Imagine that all your limbs hurt, but there is nothing that you can do about it. Imagine that something is caught in your throat and you cannot swallow your saliva. You need someone to help you aspirate the obstruction. Imagine that you are short of breath, that the air you breathe is insufficient for your body. Someone needs to place a mask on your face to relieve you. Now, open your eyes and put a very thick, opaque piece of plastic over them and try to see. You can't see anything. This is how 23-year-old Vincent Humbert describes his condition 3 years after a car accident that left him blind, mute, and quadriplegic. He was able to communicate by pressing his thumb and nodding slightly in order to spell out words. And after suffering in this condition for 3 years, and with no hope of recovering the use of his limbs, his voice, or his eyes, Vincent Humbert made a decision. He wanted to die. But he could not do it alone. He became a cause célèbre in France following the publication of a letter that he addressed to President Jacques Chirac, asking for the right to die. Now, President Chirac, though sympathetic to his ordeal, could not, of course, grant his wish, as it was not a legal thing to do in France. And Humbert says, I am kept alive for whom? For what? I do not know. All I know is that I am the living dead. Following the accident, Vincent Humbert's mother devoted herself to his care. She moved into a small apartment across from the medical facility where he was housed. But finally, Humbert asked his mother to prove her love by ending his life. She resisted at first, but was finally persuaded. And on the 3rd anniversary of the accident, she followed his wishes by putting an overdose of sedatives in his intravenous line. Her son expired 2 days later. Now, the right to aid in dying is taboo for many of us. We're uncomfortable with the idea that we can make life and death choices for ourselves, let alone for other people. But as medical technology continues to advance, I believe we must confront the subject head on. We must ask ourselves whether our ethical and moral standards need to be revised in light of the suffering so many people experience when their lives are prolonged beyond their natural course. I recognize that we're dealing here with an area that is a slippery slope. If we grant people the right to die, how soon will it be before the elderly choose death over feeling they're a burden to their children? Or before children persuade their parents to choose this option as a cost containment measure? Or if aid in dying is permitted, how many people who are temporarily depressed will lose their lives before benefiting from psychological treatment? And of course, we all know that in Nazi Germany, people who were considered mentally or physically defective were killed by the state. Ultimately, the question is, when does voluntary ending one's life become involuntary? And since one of the arguments in favor of end-of-life choices is the very subjective criterion of quality of life, why would we deny anyone this right? So we must exercise extreme caution in any contemplation of this question. We must be extraordinarily careful in framing and formulating the circumstances under which medical aid in dying might be considered. So for guidance, let us look to Jewish tradition. Judaism prohibits suicide because it affirms the sanctity of life. God gives us life, so God is the only one who can take it away. Mercy killing is thus prohibited because no distinction is made between someone who is in the process of dying and someone who is fully alive. The tradition favors doing everything possible to relieve the suffering of the terminally ill, but we do not help them end their lives. And the Reform movement has taken the position up until recently that pain and suffering are part and parcel of the human condition. They say Judaism bids us to respond to the challenges of life by choosing life. Even in debilitating illness, when our freedom of action is severely limited, we yet sanctify the divine name by living our relationship with God, by confronting our suffering with courage. Now, thankfully, this position has recently been modified, and I will come back to that in a moment. So, Jewish tradition opposes active aid in dying, such as physician-assisted end of life. But what about a passive approach where the death of a person is hastened by removing life support, stopping medical procedures, food and water, or not delivering CPR? How would Judaism view the case of Terry Schiavo, for example, the famous woman in Florida whose heart stopped temporarily when she was 26, resulting in the loss of much of her brain function? Mrs. Schiavo had been in a vegetative state for 13 years. She could breathe on her own, and her eyes were open much of the time. But without the help of a feeding tube, she would die within a few days. Mrs. Schiavo did not leave a living will, but her husband claimed that she would not have wanted to live under these circumstances. Her parents disagreed. Florida's Governor Jeb Bush, the legislature, and the courts became involved in an 8-year legal battle over Mrs. Schiavo's life. Eventually, the feeding tube was removed, and she died 13 days later. Now, while Jewish law, halakha, opposes active aid in dying, as we have seen, it is less categorical about passive aid, allowing death to take its natural course. The sages permit the removal of anything that impedes the course of nature. So contemporary rabbinic authorities permit the withdrawal of medical treatment from terminal patients under certain circumstances. Some allow disconnecting the respirator when a patient is clearly and irrevocably unable to breathe independently or sustain an independent heartbeat. They state that the respirator is merely prolonging in an artificial way the process of dying. Therefore, we must disconnect the patient from the machines, leaving him in his natural state until the soul departs. There is no consensus, however, about removing artificial nutrition and hydration, because it is not clear whether these should be considered medical treatment. Some argue that the removal of a feeding tube is the equivalent of starving the patient, so it is not permissible on moral grounds. Others claim that a feeding tube is just like a respirator, and thus can be withdrawn if the patient cannot sustain himself independently. The case of Judah HaNasi, the editor of the Mishnah, illustrates the fine line that exists between active and passive aid in dying, between allowing death to take its natural course and precipitating death. So this is a story from the Talmud. When Rabbi HaNasi was dying, his students began praying fervently for him to live. At first, his maidservant, standing on the roof of his house, prayed with them. But when she saw how every time he had to go to the bathroom, he had to take off and put on his tefillin in great pain, she prayed that he would die. Seeing his suffering continue with the prayers of his students, she dropped a jar from the roof. The shattering of the pottery scared them, and they stopped praying long enough for Judah HaNasi to die. And Jewish tradition does not fault the maidservant because she did not cause her master to die. Rather, she merely removed an impediment to his death. Now, Mr. Humbert was not about to die, so our tradition would not condone helping him too. But he characterizes his life as a kind of death. Now, I believe in the sanctity of life, but I also believe in living and dying with dignity. If someone like Vincent Humbert wants to put an end to his ordeal, is it not our responsibility as people of faith to find an ethical way to grant his wish? It's certainly incumbent upon us to first help someone who is suffering explore all possible alternatives to suicide or to aid in dying. We should also ensure that the desire for death is not the result of temporary depression, If the person persists, however, is it really our business to insist that this person confront the suffering with courage? If suffering is considered so much a part of life, why is it that we're constantly searching for ways to relieve our mental, physical, and emotional pain? Is life so precious that we should deny someone the right to end their torture? I think we must ask whose interest is being served by prolonging the agony of the ailing against their will. And I hope in the months to come, our society can engage in a vigorous and productive dialogue about this question. After all, whose life is it anyway? Now, here is the good news as far as I'm concerned. Aside from the fact that states such as Oregon and California have passed death with compassion and dignity laws, the reform movement has actually made an important shift in the case of the Medical Aid in Dying law, or MAID, as it's called, in Canada. There's a lengthy responsum on this law that I will excerpt for you. And we have to remember that this is only a response to the Canadian law, but it does mark significant progress. So first, the law. The original law limited eligibility for MAID to people who met these criteria. Make the request yourself. You have to be at least 18 years old. You have to be capable of making your own health care decisions. You have to be able to provide informed consent for the procedure. You have to be eligible for publicly funded health care. You have to have a diagnosis of a grievous medical condition. You have to have a serious and incurable illness. You have to be in an advanced state of irreversible decline. You have to experience intolerable physical or psychological suffering. And natural death has to be reasonably foreseeable. And there are, of course, a whole bunch of safeguards. The request has to be made in writing. It has to be witnessed. 2 medical practitioners who are independent of each other have to provide written opinions. The patient has to be aware of all other treatment options. The medical practitioners must confirm that this request was made freely without undue influence. There must be a 10-day reflection period between approval of the request and carrying out the procedure. And the patient, of course, may withdraw their consent at any point. Now, it's interesting that they've slightly changed the law to include unbearable suffering. And what does suffering mean? So they did a survey to see what constituted suffering for people in Canada. And I'm going to give you just the top few reasons that people considered their suffering to be unbearable. The largest percentage was loss of ability to engage in meaningful activity. And the close second was loss of ability to perform activities of daily living. Then the third reason was inadequate control of pain. And close to that was loss of dignity. And then after that, inadequate control of symptoms other than pain. So those were the top reasons that people felt that their suffering was just unbearable. Now, the responsum from the reform movement looks at our Jewish sources and sees what's been said in the past. And they quote previous responsa from like 1994 that says Jewish tradition, as is well known, prohibits suicide if by suicide we mean a rational, premeditated act of self-killing. The prohibition flows from the tradition's affirmation of the sanctity, the inviolability of human life, and it assumes, of course, that life belongs to God, and God has a final say on our life. And this implies that the individual has no right of ownership over his or her life, no authority to bring that life to a premature end. So therefore, a court may not, and I'm talking about a Jewish court, of course, may not execute a criminal on the strength of his own confession, right? It has to be on the strength of 2 other witnesses. And mercy killing is also prohibited. Even if a person is lying in a moribund state in which death is imminent, a person is still a person, a human being created in the image of God. And this life is supposed to be treasured and protected. Okay, Now, the reason there's been a shift in the reform movement's understanding of all of this is they realize that all of these beliefs about end of life come from our halachic sources, which were written a very long time ago. We've progressed in terms of medical practice since the Talmud and even since the 16th century when the Shulchan Aruch, which is the main body of law that we base our decisions on, when all that was written. And a lot of these laws were rooted in pre-modern reality where lifespans were actually pretty short, where medical knowledge and treatments were very limited, and the dying process usually was a very limited duration. So our sages, when they viewed health and disease, life and death, they were, of course, shaped by these realities. Most people died of wars, of famines, of plagues, of infectious diseases, food poisoning, infected wounds, or some kind of undiagnosable or untreatable internal problem, such as a ruptured appendix. Children died in large percentages. Childbearing led to death for many women. And death generally followed very closely upon falling ill. Very few people lived long enough to die of the various diseases that accompanied aging. So that is why the shift happened in the reform movement. So, of course, the question is, they have approved the MAID law, the medical aid in dying law in Canada. What about in the US? So I did ask the head of our Teshuvah committee, Rabbi Joan Friedman, how we might apply this reasoning to here. And she responded that our Teshuvah, our response, applies only to the Canadian law because it only applies in situations where individuals have guaranteed access to affordable medical care, including forms of end-of-life care, and where there are careful strictures in place. Questions about US healthcare will have to be on a state-by-state basis. We'll also have to take into account access to care and the cost of care. So, as I said earlier, the people in Canada have access to public health care. So it's not as though, oh, this treatment is going to cost so much money. Maybe the person is going to want to end their life, so it won't cost their, children too much money, and so they won't be a burden. That is not a factor in Canada. So here it would have to be on a state-by-state basis. Back to the responsum. So the benefit of modern medical treatments that prolong life and enable us to live with those conditions for many more months or many more years is a new thing that is not something that our sages ever had any idea about. And in the context of that reality, pronouncements about the preciousness of even a few moments of life read quite differently than they do right now. So there's some people who are not terminally ill, but who have something like ALS, just like Stuart shared, just like we have congregants in our shul who have ALS. And, if they choose to live, great. But if it's something that they find unbearable, why are we forcing them to live? So medical intervention enables many such individuals to live for many years, but offers no possibility of improvement and may not alleviate the pain of individual experiences. The same tradition that opposes murder and suicide does recognize that life is sometimes more burdensome and less desirable than death, and preserves multiple stories that affirm both ending one's own life and assistance in dying. So the responsum says, we find that the Canadian law allowing MAID adequately narrows its applicability to eligible Canadian residents capable of making this decision for themselves. There's virtually no possibility that one suffering from depression or otherwise not capable of making a rational and responsible decision would be able to use the system to take their own life. The healthcare system provides for all medical needs sufficiently that we are not worried that financial pressures might lead an individual to use the system to do away with themselves. We see no evidence that individuals with terminal or grave chronic illnesses are choosing to abandon lives they find meaningful. Rather, in an era in which medical technology can prolong life to the point where a person's existence becomes torture to them, when refuat haguf, the healing of the body, is no longer possible, we can at least support the choices of those individuals for whom death is refuat hanefesh, which is healing of the soul. So that is the Jewish position. And I would like to now introduce Judy Neal Epstein. And I'm going to spotlight her first so you can see her. And I want to give you a little introduction. She is the president and the founding director of End of Life Choices and in California. So Compassion & Choices is the organization that Stuart had mentioned initially, and that has become more of a lobbying organization, and End of Life Choices does a lot of other things, including counseling people, and Judy will talk more about that. Judy's been engaged in the study of death and dying since the early days of her undergraduate education. She has a BS in public health and a minor in nutrition science, and she received her doctorate from the National College of Naturopathic Medicine, Portland, Oregon. And she completed a residency in integrative medicine in Portland. And after 10 years of private practice, she retired and went to work for the national nonprofit Compassion & Choices. First, for the 2 years at first as clinical director of the End of Life Consultation Program, and then for 1.5 years as national medical director. She also served as a private consultant to assist in developing both the End of Life Consultation Program and volunteer program. And she served as volunteer manager for California and Oregon. This is what she does in her retirement. And right, this is what so many people do when they retire, they work hard. And Dr. Epstein was appointed and served on the State of Oregon Palliative Care and Quality of Life Interdisciplinary Advisory Council, and has served on the Compassion & Choices Oregon Advisory Council. And I could go on, but I'm not going to. I'm going to let Dr. Epstein speak, and you'll tell me when you want me to start the slides.
Great. Thank you so much, Rabbi Singer. I loved your talk. That was so interesting.
Thank you.
I'm not Jewish. My husband is a beautiful, kind, and wonderful Jewish man. So I'm walk closely to the tribe, but I'm not in the tribe. And I really loved the learning from your discussion. Thank you so much. And thank you for having us here today. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here. And I love talking about end of life choice. I love talking about the autonomy and the dignity that one receives when they can make those decisions for themselves about what they want the end of their life to look like. And as a retiring physician, you know, when I went to work for Compassion & Choices, I had a little hesitation still about this whole medical aid in dying. What does that really mean? You know, I took an oath to first do no harm as a physician, and I just was not sure about really in my heart about it, but I was there to learn and to try and make a difference. And as part of my initial training, I attended a number of deaths that were medical deaths. But the very first one I attended was on a wintry December day in the hills outside of Portland, Oregon. And I went with an Oregon volunteer, and there was this whole family gathered in this big, beautiful mountain home, and a woman who had been struggling with ovarian cancer for 4 or 5 years, and she just reached the end of the rope. There was nothing left for her, and she was suffering a lot. And it was her day that she decided to take the medication, and her bed was pulled up in front of a big glass window looking out at the forest with snow lightly coming down, and her family around her, and she took the medicine, and her family sang her out, you know, and her little 4-year-old granddaughter climbed up on the bed and curled up next to her as she was falling into a terminal sleep and dying. And it was the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen. And I realized, I don't know when it comes my time, if that's what I'll choose, but everyone should have the choice. Everyone, I believe, should have the choice. And we're lucky in California that we do now after 5 years. We've had the choice for 5 years. So that experience really just, committed my heart and soul to this work. And it's been quite a journey. So we can talk, if you have questions later, we can talk. But if you want to start the slideshow, I want to tell you a little bit about end-of-life choices and about the law in California. So so we are End-of-Life Choices California. We are a standalone nonprofit. There are other groups in other states called End-of-Life Choices Oregon, End-of-Life Choices Washington, but we're not affiliated in one big group. We are all standalone individual organizations supporting ourselves through private donations. Okay, next slide, please. And our mission statement is very simple. Our mission is to provide all Californians information and support to successfully navigate their legal end-of-life options. And we put legal in there as an afterthought just because there used to be a lot of kind of just quietly whispered ways to end your life if you wanted to before there was a law, and we no longer support those methods because we have a law. So we just thought it was important to clarify that in our mission statement. Next slide. So talking about death. Now, here we all are tonight talking about death. I'm sure everyone has different comfort levels with that conversation. I talk about it all the time, and I'm very comfortable talking about it anywhere, but a lot of people don't feel that way. And this cartoon speaks to that so beautifully, that the elephant in the room is actually on the therapy table saying, sometimes, even if I stand in the middle of the room, no one acknowledges me. And that is often the way with talking about death and dying. I can't tell you how many dinner parties I've been at where someone has said, so Judy, what do you do? And I say, oh, well, blah, 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 blah. And the talk on the table just stops. And someone might say, oh, well, let's talk about something a little more uplifting, or sometimes they'll be, wise enough to say, wow, tell us more about that. But often it's uncomfortable for people. It always makes me have a little chuckle inside when I see that. Next slide, please. So what's a good death? I think everyone probably has different ideas about that, but what we know from different studies, and a study that was published in the Journal of the American Society on Aging following a survey, is that most people want to die at home with their loved ones, not in a hospital, not in a retirement facility, but at home. And we want to die with our pain and our discomfort managed. And that can often be difficult, and hospice does a wonderful job. But there are certain kinds of illnesses and certain kinds of cancers specifically that are difficult to manage with pain medication. And so it's important that the people whose pain is not being managed have a voice. We want to have our spiritual needs respected, and we want to die without being a burden to loved ones. And Rabbi Singer mentioned that in the Canadian study. Also, it's very much in line with what we see in all the different states in many different studies. It's pretty much the same all the time. It's very, very interesting and compelling. Next slide, please. So at End-of-Life Choices California, we review a number of different end-of-life options with clients and their families and with the public. We do a lot of public speaking, and if you have a group where you'd like for us to come and talk, we'd love to come and talk. But some of the things that we talk to people about, depending on their situation, is possibly continuing reasonable or unreasonable medical treatment, stopping or declining unwanted medical treatment. Maybe you don't like chemotherapy anymore because it's ruining your quality of life and you'd rather just let your body find its way. There's hospice and palliative care. There's voluntarily stopping eating and drinking, which I'm going to talk about all of these a little bit more. There's palliative sedation, there's natural death, and there's medical aid in dying. There are a lot of options for people to think about as they think about the end of their life. So continuing reasonable treatment, and we just really encourage people to have conversations with their doctors about what are the true expected outcomes. I have this stage 3 cancer. Not very many people have a 5-year survival rate. What's treatment going to look like, and where am I going to end up? Am I going to go through all this treatment for an extra month or 2 of life? Is that really what I want? And what are the side effects going to be? Side effects are often worse than the side effects of the illness, which is interesting because the targeted therapies often aren't targeted enough. And create havoc within the body that creates more symptoms. And it really becomes an issue of deciding, is it quantity of time or quality of life? Like, what is it that's most important to you? And some people say, no, I want to live every single second I can. I don't care how much pain or suffering I endure. And other people say, nope, if I can't take care of myself and my activities of daily living on my own, I just don't want to be here anymore. It's a very personal choice. It's a very personal decision and discussion, and there's no right answer because it's everybody's answer is their own, and that's the right answer. Next slide. So here's another little cartoon. We do try to bring a little levity to this conversation. Speaking to that is, here's a physician telling the patient, you've got 6 months to live, but with aggressive treatment, we can help make that seem like much longer. And that's no fun, in my opinion. Okay, so stopping unwanted medical treatment. And this is again where it might be, it's often chemotherapy. There are other things like use of a ventilator, as Rabbi Singer was talking about, feeding tube, and IV hydration. And we all have the choice to say what we want about our care. Many people think they have to follow and do what the doctor says. And that is old information. And the doctors coming out of medical schools now, for probably the last 20 years, are much more taught about really counseling with their patients and really explaining the whole story and asking what they want, and not just saying you have to do chemo and you have to do it for 2 years and then you might live an extra month. I mean, it's not like that anymore if you ask. So I just would encourage you all to be brave with your doctors and ask them about the truth if you ever find yourself in this situation, because it's okay to say, no, thank you, I don't want to do this anymore. Next slide. Hospice and palliative care. Most people know about hospice. It's been around since the 60s, and it's just a beautiful collaborative approach to care at the end of life. There's spiritual care and volunteer support for the families, and really great pain management. They provide beds and commodes and all kinds of things for the house that a sick person might need. And it's really a good, it's really a great thing for medicine. It's kind of changed, I think, over the years. There's not very many non-profit hospices anymore, and I think they kind of do a better job than the for-profit hospices, because of course they're a business and their number one priority is making money. But hospice is a beautiful resource, and it really provides a lot of support for the patient and the family. And some people think that they have to be really near death to have hospice. And actually the national average of time on hospice is about 5 days. But people can sign up if they have 6 months or less expected life left, and get all those services. And it's all paid by the government through Medicare, no matter how old you are. And it's also mostly provided at home. And sometimes people think they have to go somewhere, and you don't. You get to have that at home. Voluntary stopping eating and drinking. And we get a lot of calls from people about this. And it's like the #1 or #2 clicked page on our website is about VSAD, which is interesting to me. But it really is about a patient making a decision to stop all food and fluid intake, everything, to just stop and let their body find their way to a peaceful death. And it takes a good, strong decision. Like, you really have to know. You can't kind of be not sure about it. You have to fully engage in the process to have it work. This is often an option for people who don't qualify for medical aid in dying, who might have some, like Parkinson's disease, as an example, is a disease that is difficult to say you have 6 months or less to live, because the disease doesn't actually end someone's life. It's the things that come along with it that do. And so maybe a Parkinson's patient might consider VSAD, or yes, VSAD, excuse me. It's not a good option for dementia patients, because with dementia, you often forget what you've decided you want, and you have to be fully 100% committed to this process every moment of every day to get to a peaceful death. It's really important that the patient is kept comfortable. It requires 24-hour support in the home. It can be rotating shifts of family members. It can be, a hired home care service that's aware of what's going on and on board and supportive. But we provide a lot of support to people about this, and we have all the do's and don'ts and questions to ask at hospice. Often when someone stops eating and drinking, if they don't have a terminal illness, after 3 days, hospice will say that there's a failure to thrive as a secondary diagnosis to maybe something else like Parkinson's, and they can then have hospice care for VSED. So there's a great video on our website under the resources called Rosemary Bowen's Fast. And you'll see our website there, and you're welcome to go on and watch it. It's very interesting about VSED. Palliative sedation is also known as terminal sedation, and it is the practice of relieving distress in the last hours or days of a dying patient's life. We see this mostly in the hospital, but we are seeing it in in-house hospice care. And it's often a great choice for people who just have that uncontrolled pain, and they are given morphine and other drugs to the point where they're very deeply sedated and almost losing consciousness. And by so doing, their body goes through the process of starting the dying process, and because of the load of medication. But the thing in this country is there are palliative physicians. It's a subspecialty now in palliative care. And the goal is not to end the life. The goal is to control the symptoms, but the process just happens to bring about a faster death that way. And this is the kind of thing you would actually have to ask a doctor for, or ask for a doctor who has experience in palliative sedation before you would ever receive it, because so many doctors don't know about it or are afraid of it because they don't know about it. Next slide. And a natural death. So, we talk about that. Like we have had people call us and say, what are all my options? And they don't want to slow their dying process, and they don't want to speed it up through any external means. They want to just turn their body over to their source of whatever it is that brings their faith about, and allow the process to unfold naturally with comfort care only. And it's very common in many different religions and cultures: Judaism, Buddhism, Hinduism, Catholicism, just to name a few. And we've had a few people that we got hooked up with a good hospice and got their families educated and helped them through a natural death. And then medical aid in dying. And this is a medical practice. The law was written originally and still is written to give a physician the legal right to prescribe medical aid in dying. And it doesn't mean that anyone and everyone has the right to access medical aid in dying, because there are so many hoops that a person has to jump through in order to access it. But it's really about a terminally ill with 6 months or less expected life, and a mentally capable adult who makes oral and written requests for life-ending medication. And I'm going to go through it just a little bit more, but that's what we've got available to us today. So here you can see the dark states, the dark blue are the states where there is medical aid and dying laws in place. There's Washington, Oregon, California, Colorado, New Mexico, Hawaii, New York, New Jersey, Vermont, and Washington, D.C. And Montana has a court case that was decided that allowed a doctor to prescribe medical aid in dying, but they don't have a law. So in California, on October 15th, 2015, Governor Brown signed the bill. And what he said, which I think is so beautiful, was that I do not know if I were dying in prolonged and excruciating pain. I am certain, however, it would be a comfort to be able to consider the options afforded by this law, and I wouldn't deny that right to others. And I just think that's a beautiful, beautiful thing to say. And the bill went into effect in June of 2016. So in order to access it's called the End of Life Option Act in California. And in order to be eligible for the law, it's the attending doctor or prescribing physician who determines that. Nobody else, the state doesn't determine it. There's no court that you have to apply to get it. It's the doctor who says, yes, I think you're eligible. You're 18 years or older and you live in California. There's nowhere does it say how long you have to live in California. You can move here and go see your doctor the next day, as long as you have an address and some form of verifying your residence through a rental agreement or an electric bill or a driver's license. Must be of sound mind and exhibit appropriate decision-making capabilities to the attending physician. Must be diagnosed with a terminal disease with life expectancy of 6 months or less, and must be able to self-ingest the medication orally by swallowing or through a feeding tube. And I think we'll talk about that a little bit again. Okay. So the process is that 2 verbal requests are made to the attending physician, a minimum of 48 hours apart. Until January of this year, it was a minimum of 15 days apart. And a lot of people never made it to the second request because they were so ill that they just didn't, they died before they could make their second request. So as of January, the law was amended to just be a 48-hour waiting period. So for some people who are really ill, they can take advantage of that, and other people just kind of go through the regular process because they have time. But for people who don't have time, that was a blessing. There's got to be 1 written request, which is a form the patient fills out. It must be signed by 2 individuals. And then a second consulting physician has to confirm eligibility and look at the medical record and confirm the diagnosis and that the person is terminally ill. But it is the patient's responsibility to make sure the physician has documented the request. So if you were in the situation where you wanted to access medical aid in dying and you asked your doctor and he or she said, well, I do think you're terminally ill, but I'm not comfortable with the law and I don't want to prescribe. So I'm going to have to send you to another doctor. Or you're going to have to find another doctor. Then it's up to the patient to say, okay, that's fine, but please document this request as my first verbal request. And people don't often know that, but we counsel people about that a lot when they call us to talk to us. So in January, as I mentioned, it was Senate Bill 380 made the minimum waiting period 48 hours instead of 15 days for the oral requests, but it also did a couple of other things. It decreed that healthcare systems and hospices now have to post their policies on their websites. So, it's great because somebody can look up and say, does the healthcare system that I'm in support this? Will my doctor be allowed to support it? Because sometimes they say, our doctors are not allowed to participate in medical aid in dying. We see that a lot in Catholic-owned healthcare systems and hospices, but we see it in others too, because people are just still afraid. It's only been 5 years, which isn't very long in medicine. There used to be a final attestation form the patient had to sign within, I think, 24 hours of dying. That's gone away. And again, if the person makes a request to the doctor and the doctor doesn't want to or can't support the request, the doctor is required to tell the patient that they don't want to do it and document the request in the patient's medical record. So I know I just said that it's up to the patient to ask that it be documented. It's now illegal if the doctor doesn't document that first request. And it is on them to transfer the patient's medical records wherever the patient wants them sent to a doctor who will participate under the law. Oh, and also the law was on had a 10-year sunset clause, and that went away, and that's now been extended to 2031. So that's good. That's all good. So this is just kind of interesting. I mean, that's a lot of numbers to look at, but a couple I'll point out to you. This is over the last 5 years, that the percentage of prescriptions written, it's gone up slightly, but not that much, and surprisingly not that many for a state of 40 million people. But the word is slow to get out. And the percentage who actually take the medicine is pretty consistent in this at about 2/3. And that speaks to what Stuart talked about with his mom, that getting the medication and having it put away safely in the top of a closet in a box where no one else can find it or get into it, brings about peace and palliative effect of comfort and relaxation. That people, there's something that happens when they get the medication and they go, okay, now I can relax because I know if things get really bad, I have a way out. And then their anxiety goes down, and then their pain goes down, and they're more able to participate with their families and their friends and find that some joy in the end of their life. And I love that effect of medical aid in dying, that it provides that palliative effect for people. For a third of the people who get a prescription, that's a big number. You'll see the number of deaths in California was not total deaths. And you'll see in 2020 and 2021, the number went up, and that's because of COVID, of course. But the percentage who use the End of Life Option Act is less than 0.5%. It's less than 1/4%. So that's really interesting. There's a lot of education for us to do out there. Next slide. So our volunteer program, we currently have about 50 trained volunteers throughout the state in small towns and large cities. A big focus in San Francisco and San Diego and LA. But we're moving into smaller communities, which is great. And a big push for us now is to be able to help people who don't have great access to medical care have at least this information. And if you, excuse me, know someone who's looking for help at the end of their life or just has questions about any of this, feel free to refer them to us. Our phone number is here. Our website is a wonderful resource of lots of great information. It's very user-friendly, and you would probably enjoy looking through it. And I think that's it. This is one of the slides from the front page of our website. And that's it. Thank you.
Do you want me to share that video or not?
Yeah, if you can, that'd be great. This is a video that Stuart commissioned from a patient back a few years ago.
About 5 years ago, I began to experience lower abdominal pain and went to my doctor, and they checked on me and said, my gosh, you have this, late discovery, rapid growing tumor, this monster tumor. We had surgery 5 years ago, 4th of July, in which my prostate was removed, but it was already clear that we were stage 4, 2 types of cancer. And then a year later, they began to rear their head again. I had more tumors. Then we went into the radical chemotherapy. By experimenting and giving a test shot, my oncologist, we did something that actually stunned the growth of the tumor. The tumor stopped, it could not be removed. So we decided to just let it ride. The ride has been delightful because my ride has been an additional 2.5 years of life.
There was a moment there where you were hoping to make it to your daughter's wedding in September.
Yes. And my oncologist told me I had 50-50 odds. Even the most casual conversation takes on 10 times the emotional value in this stage than it did when we had the casual conversation, say, before diagnosis. Yeah. I've always been a strong activist in about a dozen different directions. As long as I can keep my legs moving, I'm not stopping. But I get up with a to-do list of about 10 items every day. I'm going to go as long as I can, as long as I can. As long as my brain is working and I can serve, I want to serve. Now I have a little over 25 tumors in my body, and prostate cancer is populating my populace, my cecum, and other bits of my rib system, and also tumors in my lungs. Chemo-triggered double cataracts, had cataract surgery. Chemo triggers this. Chemo, I've lost use of my hand. I've, reflexor tendons broke, and when it becomes clear that medicine is no longer going to be helping you, you have to have the real talk with your doctor, say that we've done now everything we basically possibly can. As soon as my oncologist told me that there was nothing more that medicine could do for me, my very next word out of my mouth, because I was so interested in this, was to say, well, then I would like to go with the End of Life Options Act. The prospect of loss of control over your own existence is a terrifying thought. That connection between one's control over one's life and one's biological life, that is sacrosanct. Who has a right to come between my psyche and my body? What right? There's no right. As long as I've been sane, no one has a right to take that away from me. From that comes not a small amount of comfort, a very great amount of comfort. So this is my special medical drawer. I have everything here for my palliative care for hospice. I have future hospice drugs here, and I have the End of Life Options package with a prescription, and it brings comfort to me to know that it's here. I want everyone to understand again that it's a beautiful law, and it's a helpful law, a psychologically comforting law, not just to you as the patient, but to all the people around you. It is a monumental, favorable step in a quality of life as to how you have control the quality of the end. And no one's pushing you down any pipeline. You can get off at any time.
Well, that was a beautiful video.
Yeah.
You had mentioned Catholic hospitals and
Mhm.
physicians who are connected to Catholic hospitals.
Mhm.
And I know that they won't participate in this. So what happens if, and there are a lot of hospitals that are owned by Catholic institutions.
Yes, there are.
So what does someone do if they, encounter this and they are unable to get this end of life care that they'd like to get?
They have to find another doctor. They have to switch. One of the things that we're really lucky in California is that, and it's not happening in any other state yet, is that we have a number of hospices throughout the state where the medical director will prescribe medical aid in dying. So often, if someone is involved in a healthcare system where they are getting their care, they don't want to leave that, they like their doctor, but their doctor can't prescribe. We'll say, well, if you're terminally ill, let's just get you on a hospice with a medical director who will prescribe, if we can, if there's someone in your area. And then you could go down that route and still stay with your primary care doctor that you love, and so we try to help people do that. There are also a number of doctors in California who are like concierge doctors, geriatricians, who prescribe medical aid in dying. And so we sometimes can hook people up with someone like that, so they don't have to change their whole healthcare system and reestablish with someone else. That's hard to do without being sick or being terminally ill.
Okay, thank you.
May
So,
I chime in?
Yes, I was about to ask you to chime in. I was about to ask.
Thank you. In our hospital, HCA Hospital, you're not allowed to do end-of-life care in Riverside Community. What you have to do is you have to be discharged from the hospital and go to a skilled nursing facility or something like that. Then you can get it, but not in our hospital.
Yeah, that's not uncommon. Mhm.
I was going to ask you, Dr. Klausman, not just to weigh in on that, but to talk a little bit, because we were talking yesterday about your own experiences. Do you want to share that?
Sure, unless Diane does.
Diane?
Diane's my wife. Her mother chose end-of-life care.
Boy, this has really gotten to me. About 5 years ago, my mom was on hospice and she had about 5 critically ill diseases. She had cancer of the bladder, COPD. She was having kidney failure and a couple other things. She had several of these diseases for many years, and she was still going strong, sharp as a tack. And my mom is the smartest, bravest person that I've ever known. So she said to me that she wanted to end her life. And I'm the oldest daughter, and I'm the person that she came to and said, "Can you help me with this?" And it's what she wanted, and it was so hard to do. And Rabbi helped me with it. And 5 years ago, it was a difficult thing to find out about, but I did contact the people in Oregon at Compassion and care, and they were fantastic. And we just went about trying to find somebody that could help us with this. And that was the hardest part of it, because in those days, they wouldn't do it. And finally, we found a wonderful hospice that would do it. And my mom just was she was so pragmatic about it. And I felt like it's what she wants. It's what I have to do for her. And I did not want her to suffer, because she was going to start having some really bad symptoms. She started to have itching all over her body, and I would put lotion on her to stop the itching continually, but at a point it just didn't help. And I was not going to see my mom suffer. She didn't deserve that. And so she said, okay, we're going to go through with this. And I said, okay. So in those days, it was where you had the physician come, and my mom was so sharp, and she would explain to him, yes, I want this. And we had to wait 15 days from that point back then. And I'm so glad it's been truncated, because that's miserable. Once you make the choice, let's do it. So 15 days later, she spoke to another physician from the hospice, and they asked her how does she want to do it? And she designated this cocktail, and it was delivered to our house, and Alan and all my family was there, and she took the cocktail, and we all just waited patiently. And it was hard for it to be a wonderful thing, so like this other person had explained how they did this beautiful gathering, but it just was harder for me. I still have trouble with it, but it was absolutely the right thing to do, because my mom did not deserve to suffer for 1 minute. She was the most wonderful woman, and she had never had pain in her whole life. She had no surgery, and she was just such a great gal and so brave. So I'm more happy that I was able to help her with it, but still it's so hard the reality of it was really hard.
Diane, thank you so much for sharing that with us. Really appreciate that. And I'd like to open it up to anybody who has any questions, comments. Does anybody have anything they want to share, or any questions they have? I mean, Judy gave a great presentation and very clear. Zoom user, I don't know who you are, but go ahead. You have your hand up, Zoom user. I don't know if you
They're
intended
muted.
that.
They're muted.
Unmute. Can you unmute? Maybe they didn't intend to raise their hand.
Oh, this is
Oh, there you go. Go ahead.
I personally am more concerned about dementia, the umbrella of that, Alzheimer's, all of that. Dementia runs in my family, and I find what the main talk of this was about pain. Well, Alzheimer's isn't about pain, and it's a very slow, horrible way to face the end of life. And I happened to, at a particular time, go into an Alzheimer's corridor, and I was devastated by these patients in beds lined up in a corridor that were not alive, but breathing. They didn't even acknowledge anybody passing by. They had to be fed. It was so terrible. And I don't want that to happen to me, but it's a slow thing. And I watched a couple of movies made on this topic. One lady in the movie chose to have her tablets ready and all of that. And when it came time, she realized this is the time, the tablets all threw on the floor and somebody walked in. Do you have any advice, or what are the possibilities of action in this scenario?
Thank you, Adrian. Go ahead, Judy.
Thank you. That is a very real fear and concern. I hear you. And you know, the medical aid in dying, it was not designed for advanced or even moderate to advanced dementia or Alzheimer's disease. If the person who wants the drug doesn't remember every moment of every day why they want the drug. And it also requires still, of course, a terminal diagnosis. And there is no terminal diagnosis with Alzheimer's or dementia until the very end, when it's way too late. So sadly, there are no provisions for that yet in the United States. You know, Switzerland and I think the Netherlands now have programs that address and support those people. And there's a book out recently about a woman and her husband's experience with that. One thing we do have on our website is called a dementia directive. It's kind of something you can add to your advanced directive that addresses concerns around dementia. And it's tough. It's not legally binding, but it can definitely educate a physician and family members about what you want. You can no longer say for yourself. It says things like, if I no longer recognize the people I love, I wish to not be fed food or given water or fluids anymore. And you can bring them in the room, but put them across the room for me. Don't bring them close enough so I can smell them. And let me go get them if I want them. Now, probably I won't do that because I won't remember what it means to go get food anymore. You know, it's a very, very difficult disease. But there are things in that directive that you can think about and fill out and review with your family and anybody else who's involved in your care, so that perhaps you won't end up being that person in the hallway on a gurney and something different will happen. But it's a tough thing. I hear you.
Yeah. Joan, go ahead.
Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Is there any provision for delegating the actual giving of the pill to anyone else, like with the power of attorney or anything like that?
No.
That would solve a lot of those problems. I myself today entered my brother into hospice, and my younger brother by 11 years, as a matter of fact. And very difficult because he would not give me a power of attorney. So because he lives in Florida, and the Florida law says that I can make decisions because I am, you know, they have this ladder of relatives, you know, wives. Yeah. I have another sister, but she doesn't want to deal with this. So I'm in the situation where he would probably, I mean, if it were me, I would just like to end it. But I was curious if anything is coming around the bend to give this right once a person makes this declaration for another person to help them carry it out.
No,
No.
not in the United States.
Yeah.
It's just, you know, the only way a law was ever passed in a state, the United States, was by putting all these barriers to abuse in place.
Mhm.
There was so much fear that people were going to be coerced into taking medication,
Mhm.
slip to the medication,
Yeah,
their inheritance or whatever. There were
right.
silly concerns which have never come into play, never have come into play ever.
Yeah.
But that's still the law. It's very clear. You have to self-ingest. You have to know what you're doing. You have to
Mhm.
be ill. The law is very, very clear about that.
Okay, so I'm not going to dispense with my stash of morphine yet.
Okay.
Oh, thanks for that question, Joan.
You are not alone.
Yeah. Unfortunately, yeah, there are all these restrictions. So Barbara Droutman asks, how does your healthcare directive factor into your choice of options for EOL?
Mm.
Well, in your healthcare directive, you can say what kind of care you want in the event of if your heart stops, do you want it to be restarted? You can say no. If you can add a line in there that says, if I don't ask for food, don't bring it to me. Or if I don't ask for water and I never want a feeding tube, I can't swallow on my own, that's it for me. So you can have some control with that. And again, it's not legally binding, but it does give you an opportunity to spell out what your individual desires and wishes and beliefs are and how you want to be treated at the end of your life. And if you add in the dementia directive, that's really good information too for your family. I highly recommend that you find that and download it or print it and fill it out and add it to your advanced directive.
Thank you, Judy. By the way, there is a wonderful film that was made by the sister of a Reform rabbi in Brooklyn. It's called The Last Flight Home. And I was actually trying to get it to show it in conjunction with this session. Unfortunately, right now it's owned by MTV Productions or something, and they're not willing to release it for private showings yet. But if you get a chance to see it, and I will keep trying, it's about, Judy, have you seen it yet?
No, I haven't seen it.
Oh, it's really, really excellent. So
Yeah.
it's about their father who, decides he's going to end his life. And, it's the 2 weeks preceding that moment. And the family is very, very loving. And, they just spend time with him and they're surrounding him. And, it's very hard, of course, just like Diane said, it's not, it's not easy to say, okay, we're going to help you go, even though it's the right thing to do, but it's very painful. You love the person. You don't want them to go. And I suppose we always have in the back of our minds, oh, maybe there'll be a miracle and the person will somehow, be okay. But anyway, it's really worth seeing. The Last Flight Home. Do people have other questions or comments? Okay. Well, Judy, thank you so much for your
My
excellent
pleasure.
presentation.
My
And,
pleasure.
and if people need the website or information about how to get in touch with this wonderful organization, I have it, and you can come to me. So thank you all for being here. And
Yes, thank you. Thank you for having me.
oh, it was our pleasure. It was our
Yeah.
pleasure in a certain sense.
Well, these are important conversations. It's
Definitely
important.
Thank you.
Yes,
important and difficult. It's the elephant, right?
the elephant.
All right. Well, thanks so much.
All
Good
right.
night, everyone.
Thanks.
Right.
Bye.